Oh, suffer puppet crying and drama. And, I just got hit with a spell and I'm dying and save me.
Pause game. There, it's coming together. It's all coming together, as they say. 3, 2, 1, lay on.
I am Liz Christensen, host of the Refuge LARP Salt Lake City Vodcast, and today I am joined by Marley Gable, who is the head of rules, to talk about rules things and the Refuge LARP launch effort on a national level. He's also involved in that. So let's dive in and start talking about rules and the Great Transition, which is what I'm calling it. It will go down in history as the Great Transition. You are the head of rules, though, for our Salt Lake chapter. What is a rules team?
Well, I'm so glad to be here tonight. Thank you for having me on. A rules team is the set of individuals who are a part of our community who really like to look at the way the rules can be used to tell a story. There are a few types of people who make that up. You have marshals, who are there to make sure everyone plays the game fairly and answer any questions that come up when unique applications of the rules are put into place by plot type people. And then you have kind of the rules team itself, who are themselves marshals, but do a little bit of homework at times where they look at what are some cool ways we could make people feel more special with the rules, what are some ways we could do things locally that would support the kind of story arc that's coming up, and kind of apply a what if and how do we execute the future mindset to things.
How do you make people feel special with the rules?
So Refuge LARP has an enormous number of character options. To be anything you can kind of imagine yourself as in a epic fantasy story. There are plenty of rules to be a knight with a flaming sword, or a wizard who is doing a big ritual to summon a servitor creature or to open a portal, or those sorts of things. But in the genre of fantasy, there is a limitlessness to what a character could maybe do. We've all seen our favorite superheroes learn they have an extra power. And that is something that the plot team locally likes to empower. So to some extent, sometimes it's just for one adventure, you might have a certain spell that is unique, or there may be one place in the world where all characters suffer a drawback except a certain type of individual. And so places where people can shine in the framework of the game are what I mean by that. Variations beyond the robust system that typically exists. What if you were a werewolf? Stuff like that.
Where does a player go about finding the rules?
So there's a very responsive social media team that can always help guide very directly to it. But on the core website, www.refugelarp.com, there's a nice floating menu that says rulebook, and clicking on that will take you right to the PDF, which is a sort of live document. As time goes on, there will be more accessibility-oriented versions of this, as well as places to just find it online.
When the local chapter is empowering players to feel cool through the rules, how does that get communicated?
Ooh, interesting question. In some cases, this would be, for example, if a character in our game casts a spell, there is a verbal call associated with that. And usually these calls for spells have both an incantation, which is you summoning up the magic, and an effect, which are the game rules terms that a person is listening to. The summoning up the magic part isn't where I would say a special rule could come in, while you might typically say something like, with Mystic Force, and then come out with the rule. A special or unique rule would allow someone to swap out that incant and maybe do something along the lines of, because I am awesome, I. Right, like obviously a silly example, but let's say the character is from the big empire in our setting, Helios. Maybe as they're calling out their magic, they get to use their hometown's name in the incantation instead of just the generic summoning of elemental powers.
And that's something that rules will communicate to them, like a marshal, like you talked about, or is that part of the paper that happens at logistics?
It could be all of the above. If it's a very temporary thing, it's something that a plot member might just bring up to a character and say, hey, you have this opportunity if you would like. But if it's a bigger part of their ongoing story, maybe something right before perhaps they're intending to retire their character, or just, I guess in trope language, a crowning moment of awesome, then most likely the rules team will have chatted with the plot team who says, we want to tell this story for the character or give them this option to live up to this story. How can we do that that will be evocative and won't be disruptive or unfair to other players? The rules team will get together, come up with an idea, and tell the plot team, who will most likely tell that player in advance of that particular event or adventure.
Talk me through some of the mechanics as people learn the rules, how rules is going to like function in a game for someone who's never been before.
Totally. Well, the good news is we're all very friendly, and while rules are important as they are in sport, and as they are in like an improvisational game is also going to have rules. The rules that we have in LARP keep a level playing field and keep the story moving forward. So you're going to be able to learn things as you play in many cases, although we love it when people choose to read the rule book or parts of it in advance. That's awesome too. In practice, a lot of the ways that a character interacts with the rules comes down to the way conflicts are negotiated. So as Refuge LARP is kind of what is called an American sport LARP or a boffer LARP. So we have cool, latex or other safe material shaped weaponry, and people will be working against challenging and wicked foes where they're swinging these foam swords or staves or what have you around. And as they're doing so, they're going to communicate that RPG mechanic of reducing the hit points of their foes when they manage to achieve the sport element of like striking the person's shoulder or torso or what have you. Rules come in where you would be communicating those strikes verbally. So by saying like 2 normal or 3 flame, you're letting a person know how many of their hit points to kind of mentally deduct before they're defeated. But the rules can also take a less effect orientation and be about safety. Just as I keep referencing sports, we're not trying to hit each other in the head or on the hands, things like that. So the rules are there to communicate safety in sporting, but also safety in storylines and social interactions for people to be able to best grow and kind of explore their own characters.
Elaborate on that a little bit in case people are wondering how that kind of safety figures into us hitting each other with fake weapons.
Totally. So while we are a game that has some sport-like elements, it's not just capture the flag or a line of fighters constantly going at each other. There's a narrative to the game that the plot team is kind of putting out there. But everyone is also, all the player characters or the participants are telling stories about their own characters and kind of can improv that and work with others to create interesting drama amongst themselves, or even work on some real world growth. Maybe you play a character that is very shy because you're the kind of person who will usually talk to cover the fact you're anxious, or maybe the opposite, you're going to try playing a character who's bold and decisive because in the real world maybe that's not your strongest suit. And so that everyone ends up feeling comfortable with how the things like players having an argument like you'd see on a soap opera, or similar frictions are navigated. There's the idea that you should check in with a person and say, hey, is it going to be okay if I yell at your character? Or, so the alternative where a person can kind of give a quick signal saying, oh, this acting is so good, it's a little too intense for me, let's take it down a notch, without pausing everything. So that's kind of what I mean in terms of social rules. We have visual cues and communication and consent-oriented storytelling paradigm, I guess.
What do you do when rules aren't being followed?
So I hate to say it, but everybody breaks the rules a little bit all the time. In a very math-heavy game, knowing exactly whether you got hit 10 times or 11 is a little bit of a challenge, right? We all try our best, and the rules are designed to make the mental load as minimal as possible. For most tiny infractions, there's no way to, there's no one who's going to make you feel guilty about that. Maybe you've fumbled we've talked about spell incants, or maybe you took one hit too many. If anybody actually notices, if it gets in the way of the story, then people will tend to just do a very calm sort of correction, like, oh, you should be in, here's how the incant's supposed to go. It's not with eldritch mana, it's with eldritch force. So we take a teaching tone, and part of the nice element of community building is that to a certain extent everyone can help each other out with the rules. Of course, sometimes you're losing at Monopoly and you have the type of person who's going to flip over the game board, and that's really not something you want in a fair play or environment. Good sportsmanship is important. So if someone is breaking the rules on purpose, or it's kind of a pattern, then a individual who's a marshal or a member of rules team will notice this or hear about it. If you are seeing this kind of thing and you're playing, then seeking one of us out is a perfect thing to do. And when we do, we'll try and have a communicative moment or a teaching moment with the person and say, hey, if you're getting so frustrated about this, what are some different ways we can approach that frustration? In rare circumstances, you have extremely dangerous circumstances, like if someone's charging around at night and not paying any attention at all, and this is a regular thing, there are remedies in the game where we can say, hey, you got to play a non-combat character for the rest of the event, or even, you're making things unsafe for people and we don't want you to continue being a part of the community. Again, that's super, super rare, and for the most part, noticed rules breaks are just talked about for like 10 seconds and then everyone moves on.
Do you have some ideas for us about like what kind of rules might be different for experienced LARPers from other games? Like what's kind of unique to Refuge?
Ooh, I have some tea on that indeed. We are very cognizant of the fact that we're honoring a tradition of American sport LARP that has been around for more than 20 years. You're still going to be calling out to normal and using parries, and a continuity is probably the word I'd emphasize the very most in this transition. But we've seen a lot of opportunities to, make things better with the next iteration compared to some contemporary or predecessor style American sport LARPs. Perhaps most interesting to me is the move away for very experienced LARPers from the term hold, which is kind of a circumstance where everybody stops what they're doing because we want to make sure safety is being observed. If someone's glasses fly off, a person is going to yell the word hold, and everyone else knows that they should pause and take a beat to ensure that can get resolved quickly and safely. Well, we've just taken the logical step of turning that into pause game being yelled out so that it's perfectly obvious to folks who are new, and so that we can have more fun saying things like hold the door or hold, who goes there, right? That said, we're also trying to keep in mind that we're growing toward a more perfect society. So there's a little bit more of an emphasis on not labeling entire species as being uniquely terrible or always feeling they're superior to those around them. We have made some adjustments to how the kind of psionic powers, the mental role play works. So it's clearer, it is more clearly verbalized, unlike that. When that initiates, we've taken some terms and transformed their names, like craftsman is now the broader trades. This is a skill in our game where you basically get in-game currency, gold and silver coins for being an expert in something. And the thought is that trades more broadly describes the sort of expertises a character might have than kind of insinuating that they are specifically crafting some material object. With that, ultimately some of the larger changes are species oriented in how the storylines or flavors of those species are presented. On the whole, if you're familiar with this kind of a game, you will have at most 5 minutes of study to do.
Not a ton of change.
Not a ton of change at this point. Tweaks and corrections. One thing that's exciting, if I can burst in here, is that the intention of this game is and this organization is to be a little more oriented to how video games can be, or even modern RPGs for tabletop, where we publish hotfixes, we publish errata, we have a more living document. It's a kind of a newer paradigm in my experience as a LARPer, where usually you're waiting for the next edition to fix things that everyone knows need to be kind of tweaked to make a better experience. In this case, our plan is to just get in there and do that. So we won't overwhelm people with updates all the time, but we'll kind of have a live document, one that's rolling forward and meeting needs as they arise.
Is there a mechanism for disseminating that is proactive, as opposed to not for the player, but for the rules people, so that if I'm not constantly checking back, like, how do I get updated?
Well, we're going to have patch notes. Just like, if your smartphone's got a little bit of an update, it'll pop up and say that. When we gather at events, we always have a kind of what is called opening circle, usually, where everyone gets together, and before we declare that game on has happened or that everything has started. And during that period, it'll be mentioned. Of course, there will also be these patch notes, which will be disseminated through the website that was mentioned, social media announcements. And those will tend to be really well publicized and typically quite small. For most players, it usually won't affect too much. It'll be like some commas moving around, or hey, we're going to use this terminology now because it's more elegant to explain what happens, or more similar to how other rules like it occur. Of course, well, I'll save this next idea for a little bit.
Ah, okay. Hopefully we get there. Talk to me about what your favorite rule is.
Oh, to ask a rules guy that is certainly to like asking for a favorite child. Um, there, there are different ways of looking at rules. Rules in our game are sometimes synonymous with the idea of specific effects or skills or spells, that sort of stuff. What do I like to say the very most? Well, I think it's really fun to be able to build a ward. The ward spell is really neat because it creates a tangible story element that others begin to interact with. Ward,
What's a ward?
yeah, a ward takes a game area, usually a specific room or a cabin, and makes it so that individuals are safe within that ward if they've been invited into it, or if they have been there at the casting of the spell, and the forces of bad and wicked elements can't just come up into them. But it also, what I like about it is that it's a little more persistent, and it adds a element to the game where if you're casting a fire spell, it happens in an instant and the game rolls on. A ward is going to be a little bit lasting. It can be used for lots of different scenes as a sort of prop. It might allow for some intrigue, a real place for some people to secretly scheme while everyone else is and not inside the ward and can't just walk up to them. So I enjoy that skill. On a broader level, rules-wise, I really like that we hold the idea in Refuge LARP Salt Lake City, but even more broadly, that we are, and I would call this a rule. You'll find it maybe not explicitly printed in the rule book, but throughout the culture and documentation, that we're there to all work together and create a shared role-playing experience. I think a lot of RPGs and, pardon me, games can get away from the idea that you're getting to have a social experience and focus a little bit more on the winning. And I love that our game says the goal is to have a good time and entertain others, rather than saying the goal is to have the most awesome character. Although, of course, you strive for having some cool moments.
Would you say that's kind of I mean you linked it to the culture, but it sounds a lot like just a premise. Like that's maybe the point of the game?
That is perfect. A perfect way to look at it. I really think that when we're playing to create memories instead of necessarily solve the puzzle, we have the very best experiences. For rules subsystems, I really like what I'd referenced previously, the mental abilities, or the capacity for characters in the right circumstances to do stuff like telepathy, or to change others' memories, or help them overcome phobias and stuff like that. I think leads to really juicy social interaction scenes. But there are a lot of subsystems in the game that people can learn if they'd like, or that won't impact them if they don't. And there's kind of something for every type of player out there. I know a lot of folks really love to yell doom, or and throw out this incredibly dangerous 500 damage type strike. And so that's, I gotta say, it's elegant. It does what it says, and that's pretty fun.
I like that. Let's kind of switch gears to the national level and the things that you've been doing there. Describe for me what you have been doing. Do you have like a title?
I am the secretary of Refuge. In that capacity, I help the president of our corporation and the board of directors ensure that scheduling is all in order for internal meetings and ensure that the topics that need to be discussed are being discussed. The people who need to know different stuff, right hand talking to left hand, is taken care of. I'm also privileged to represent, since I am head of rules in Utah, Salt Lake's seat on the multi-chapter. We have games in many states. The multi-chapter RRC, or Rook, for fun, which is the rules committee which evaluates changes for the game in the future and issues clarifications when the need arises where it will affect a lot of people.
So you are 100% the guy to talk to when somebody in the chapter wants to make a suggestion about a future alteration of the rules.
Absolutely. That's a pretty good segue to what I was hinting at earlier. Sometime after we've all been able to get back to playing live games and every chapter is able to play with this 1.0 document for a season, a game season. So in often cases a year, we're going to be coming out with a new edition of the rules, which is going to have a whole lot of creative energy put into it. And play testing is important as well to any updates that are significant. So if you've got ideas, certainly bring them to me. We're already in discussion about how to make things better in the future and more exciting, more option dense, and simpler to understand.
Option dense. I like that. That means I have a lot of options, yes?
Exactly so. And, I said in fantasy, there's that endlessness to character options, and we wanted to bring the game even closer to reflecting that. So there'll be most likely some new skills to consider and even some subsystems that aren't in the game already, but that is certainly in our future, so I better not go too deep on that.
That is an intriguing teaser, though. Tell me what else you've seen, like from working behind the scenes on the national level with this transition and launch that's exciting to you or encouraging.
Ooh, oh, both of those words in spades sum up my transition experience. What I'd say about encouraging elements is how very passionate and methodical this great transition has been. I think that we've carefully examined the premises that underlie our genre of game and that have dictated how social media is used more and more in the modern day, and how easy it is to get feedback from great numbers of players. And we have sprung into action on obtaining that feedback, on making sure that our premises match with the outcomes we're desiring, and looking at every bit of how the game's organizational structure, it's like org chart, works together, and every bit of how the rules play out in premise. With the big break people have been taking from LARPing, it's allowed folks to have plenty of time and creative energy to just nail this. As for excitement, it's been really nice to see a visual language developed for design that's going to be throughout the game, and to put a facelift on something that does have such long roots. It's been great to take the hundreds of questions to see, the interests of about 1,000 people in the transition, and that's been pretty exciting as well. Um, every week we're at it, working to make the game a little bit closer to kind of official rollout day, which is January 1st.
Yeah, so prior to this, so game will be out by the time people see this and watch us and listen to us talk about it.
I'm excited for that day, and I'm also excited that a watchword has been flexibility. In a organization that's as much about collaborative storytelling as ours at actual events, we've uplifted some of those principles into the corporation and into the national volunteer and staff positions. We've got amazing best practices documented, but we also know that if we find something better, if we hear new feedback, that taking it and implementing it swiftly is in everyone's best interest. So that excites me too.
Tell me what you mean anecdotally or elaborating by this visual language in the design of the game that you referenced.
Totally. As the hobby grows, you find that there are people who play who are experienced in things like document design or brand elementation. And in short, there will be palettes and fonts and symbols that really evoke our game throughout its documents, its web presence, and even a little bit on events. And I think, quite literally, that's the sort of icing on the cake environment. And I like that a lot. It takes, to me, it separates our game from a lot of contemporaries, which have excellent explanations of themselves, but don't necessarily wrap a bow on top in the way a more professional game might. And so it's been nice to see sort of a professionalization of a traditionally amateur
environment. To finalize and kind of wrap a bow up on our conversation, why do you LARP, Marley?
That is a lovely question as well. LARPing has, for me, been a wonderful part of my life for a long time. And with the opportunity to take a longer break from going to events, I was able to look at whether this is something that is just a habit or something that, I really enjoyed, and think about some of those reasons in depth. And it is something that I love. And some of those reasons are that it's so much fun to me as a creative or as someone who likes to get into building stories, to be challenged by and see by other individuals who are also out there trying to tell stories spontaneously, and to work in small groups or in big groups to create tones and story arcs together. I love there's to me nothing like that experience when you're doing it with 30, 40, 100 or more people, that just beats out things like writers' rooms or a low, like Dungeons and Dragons type game experience. The scale is amazing. I often use LARP as a component of being physically fit, because we do have the sporting combat elements of the game. I LARP because, it keeps me in motion. It's great cardio. It's a great way to build endurance, especially. Better at hiking and soccer than I was before I was into this sort of thing. And those, LARPing, when you want it to, can always be an opportunity to learn new skills or to try out different philosophies, see how you might, as you're depicting different characters or talking to other people's characters, to generate anything from empathy to lockpicking to learning to, bake bread in character is something that I've seen and done. So I love the skill acquisition component that the game can become, the real world skill that comes out of LARPing.
To borrow one of your words, I think that's a very elegant answer. I like that.
Well, thank you. And I mean, in any day and age, we all want a little bit of entertainment, escapism, and this game can, if you will, be a refuge from the real world.
Thank you so much, Marley, for letting me interview you about rules and the transition, the great launch and everything today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, my pleasure. I'm very excited for your series to continue. Have a great night, Liz.
Everybody, if you want to join us on Discord, that would be great. We're super active there, especially right now before we have live events. But also be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel because we're going to have more of these vodcasts. You don't want to miss them. So subscribe here, join us on Discord, and we'll see you when we have our next live game.